It's time to start testing the state of our application. In our application, we're using Pinia to help us with managing state. As far as testing is concerned, you will most likely write tests for verifying the behavior of your actions and getters. For starters, we're going to write tests for our actions. Let's write a test for verifying that the user gets authenticated into our application. Open the user.js file. In this file, we have an action function called authenticate. If this function gets called with valid credentials, the user should get logged into our app. At the end of the function, the user logged in property will be set to true. We can assert the value of this state property. Let's get started. In the tests folder, create a file called pinia.spec.js. Next, import two functions called setActivePinia and createPinia from the Pinia package. We aren't going to import any components because we want to test the store in isolation. We don't need to mount a component to test the store. We will need the createPinia function to create a fresh instance of the Pinia class. Next, we'll import the user store. Add the describe function with the following identifier, stores. Next, call the before each function. During the testing of our components, we created a unique instance of a component before writing test assertions. This same idea should apply to testing our stores. Stores should not leak from test to test. To avoid leaks, we can reset the Pinia instance. The before each function will run a function before a test is executed. Let's pass in an arrow function. Inside this function, call the setActivePinia function. Before we can create stores, an active instance must be available. However, we can't create an active instance unless a view instance is available. The developers of Pinia have created this function for tricking Pinia of an active instance during testing. In this function, we can pass in a Pinia instance. Let's pass in the createPinia function. Great! We'll always have a unique instance of Pinia before each test. Let's write our test. Inside the block, call the test function. The description will be the following: authenticates user. In our test, we're going to create a variable called store. We'll set this variable to the value returned by the useUserStore function. To get started, we're accessing the store. We can use the store's functions and properties like we would in our components. We can begin writing the test assertion. We're going to write two of them. The first assertion will check the default state. The second will check the state after the action has been called. Call the expect function with the store.userLoggedIn state property. Next, chain the toBe function with a value of false. This assertion will test if the state property is false. This is one way of testing a false value. Here's a cool trick you can do with tests. Vitest has a feature called modifiers. You can think of Vitest modifiers as similar to directive modifiers in Vue. They change the behavior of a function. Before chaining the toBe function, add a modifier called not. The not modifier will reverse the behavior of the function chained after it. In this example, it'll test if the state property is not false. This test will throw an error because the default value is false. Let's change the value to true. The next step is to run the action. Call the store.authenticate function with an empty object. We're passing on an empty object. We're not interested in passing in valid credentials to Firebase. Firebase is not what we're testing. We're testing if the action function sets the user logged in state property to true. The authenticate function is asynchronous. If your action functions are asynchronous, you should add the async await keywords. Let's add them in the appropriate locations. Lastly, we can test if the property was set to true. We'll copy the last assertion we had without the not modifier. Alright, let's run the test. The test will fail. According to the report, Firebase requires an email. Here's the thing. We're not interested in letting Firebase run. We're just interested in our action function. To get around this dilemma, we need to mock Firebase. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. One of the main takeaways with testing the store is not having to mount a component. Stores are objects we can test in isolation. We don't need a component or view application to be running to test the store. That's great. It allows us to test the state in isolation. In the next lecture, we'll continue testing the store.